Hello everyone, you are watching the first part in the 11th video of Genesis in a Bible study video series. In this video, we will go through Genesis chapter 10, verses 1 through 20. This section we're going to be going through contains general information about how the earth was repopulated, and where different nations came from. This is an interesting and difficult section of research. Many modern historians only loosely accept what Scripture says about history. This means that while Scripture has been semi-accepted as a reliable source of information, there's still a disconnect between today's popular history and history according to Scripture. This can sometimes make research even more difficult, if you disagree. Beginning in verse 1 it says, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, namely, of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And unto them were sons born after the flood." Even though all three sons had wives before the flood, none of their children were born until afterwards. Some may disagree, but I'll go over this in the second part of this video. Continuing on in verse 2 it says, "The sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. Of these were the isles of the nations divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." Before we get any further, I want to address something. It seems that some of the names mentioned in this chapter are generally believed to not be the names of any particular person, but instead groups of people or nations. For example, some would either say that Canaan wasn't an actual person, but represented the Canaanites in the book of Genesis, or that Canaan was a real person, but was renamed Canaan in Genesis because of the Canaanites' name. To put it another way, the question being asked is whether the people were named after an individual, the individual was renamed after his future people, or if the individual was only a symbolic figure in Genesis that represented a future people. It is possible that Genesis chapter 10 could be referring to a people when the singular is used, because the LXX, which has been said to contain what's called Hebraisms, seems to speak of groups of people in the singular. For example, in Judges chapter 6 verse 3, the ASV says, "And so it was, when Israel had sown, that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, and the children of the east, they came up against them." Compare that with the LXX as published by Cambridge University Press in 1887, which can be translated as, "And it happened whenever the man Israel, singular, had sown, also came up Midian, singular, and Amalek, singular, and the sons of the east, plural, and they came up upon them." So again, it is possible that when the text gives a name in the singular here in chapter 10, it's not referring to an individual, but to a people. On the other hand, it's also possible that this isn't the case, at least most of the time in Genesis chapter 10. Remember that the children of Israel are simply called Israel in many places throughout the scripture, and Israel, also known as Jacob, was a real person. This could also be true of all or almost all of the people mentioned in this chapter. The people and their nations could have been named after their progenitor. So, the Canaanites could have been named after a real person named Canaan. Now I'll say what I think is true. Some of the names mentioned in Genesis chapter 10 may be for a group of people. For example, I think that in verses 16 through 18, the sons of Canaan have names that are plural in Hebrew, which signifies the text is referring to groups of people. At the same time, I think that all of the names, or almost all of the names, mentioned as if they're names in the singular, are referring to actual individuals. I think it's possible that some of the names mentioned in chapter 10 aren't original because they were changed later on. For example, it's pretty obvious that Sodom and Gomorrah, mentioned in verse 19, were not the original names of those two cities, but what they became known as after they were destroyed. Like those two cities, people may have become known by another name in their own lifetime or afterwards, and these names were then probably transferred onto the people they were known to have begun. Even if this is true, this still means the people were named after their progenitors, not the other way around. Josephus seems to have agreed with me that the nations were named after people, and seems to generally think that they were the first rulers of their people. He said, "Now they were the grandchildren of Noah, in honor of whom names were imposed on the nations by those that first seized upon them." After that he also said, "Japheth, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. Settling themselves on the land which they light upon, which none had inhabited before, they called the nations by their own names." I won't lean too heavily on Josephus's writings in this video, because I don't know how reliable his writings are. I don't believe that everything he wrote is accurate, but some of it is definitely worth quoting. I think there's something else we should keep in mind here. When names move from language to language, they can change in sound and appearance. Keeping this in mind may help when trying to understand Genesis chapter 10, especially when you take into account what happened at Babel. Easton said this of Gomer: "He is generally regarded as the ancestor of the Celtae and the Cimmeri, who in early times settled to the north of the Black Sea, and gave their name to the Crimea, the ancient Chersonesus Taurica." Easton later continued, "Thus, the whole Celtic race may be regarded as descended from Gomer." Josephus, Easton, and Smith all seem to agree that the Scythians came from Magog. Josephus said, "Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who were by the Greeks called Scythians." Easton says this of the name Javan: 1. The fourth son of Japheth, whose descendants settled in Greece, i.e., Ionia, which bears the name of Javan in Hebrew. Alexander the Great is called the King of Javan, rendered Grecia, Daniel chapter 8 verse 21, chapter 10 verse 20, compare chapter 11 verse 2, Zechariah chapter 9 verse 13. This word was universally used by the nations of the East as the generic name of the Greek race. 2. A town or district of Arabia Felix, from which the Syrians obtained iron, cassia, and calamus. Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 19. Strong said the word translated as isles in verse 5 means properly a habitable spot, as desirable, dry land, a coast, an island. In general, Japheth's children spread out towards the northwest. Verse 6 continues, "And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Put, and Canaan. And the sons of Cush, Seba, and Havilah, and Sabta, and Rama, and Sabtika." and the sons of Rama, Sheba and Dedan. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before Jehovah. Wherefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before Jehovah. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land he went forth into Assyria, and builded Nineveh, and Rehoboth-ir, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. The same is the great city. And Mizraim begat Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Naphtuhim, and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, whence went forth the Philistines, and Caphtorim. Strong says this of the name Cush. Cush, or Ethiopia, the name of a son of Ham, and of his territory. This word is generally translated as Ethiopia and Ethiopians throughout the Old Testament, or it's simply transliterated as Cush, like here. Strong says this of the name Mizraim. Mizraim, i.e., Upper and Lower Egypt. This word is generally translated as Egypt and Egyptians throughout the Old Testament, or it's simply transliterated. There's another Havilah in this chapter, which we'll talk about in part 2. Strong says this of the name Sheba. Sheba, the name of 3 early progenitors of tribes and of an Ethiopian district. It makes sense that Sheba would be in Ethiopia, because Cush, Sheba's grandfather, is, as I said before, what the Hebrews called the Ethiopians. The account of how the Queen of Sheba came to Solomon can be found in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Jesus called the Queen of Sheba the quote, Queen of the South in Matthew chapter 12, verse 42, which agrees with Sheba being in Ethiopia, which is south of Israel in Africa. The word translated as mighty one in verse 8 and mighty in verse 9 is the same word translated as mighty men in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Strong says this of the name Babel. Confusion, Babel, i.e., Babylon, including Babylonia and the Babylonian Empire. Strong says this concerning Shinar. Shinar, a plain in Babylonia. Though most of the time in the Old Testament the word transliterated in verse 10 as Babel is used for Babylon, the city, Babylonia, the country, and Babylonians, the people, in a few places in the Old Testament the word transliterated as Shinar is used instead. There seems to be 2 ways to view verses 11 and 12. Either the Hebrew text means that Nimrod went from Shinar into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin, or that Ashur, which can also mean Assyria in Hebrew, according to Strong in the ASV footnotes, went from Shinar, where Nimrod ruled, and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin. Concerning Assyria, Smith said, Assyria was a great and powerful country lying on the Tigris. Genesis chapter 2, verse 14. The capital of which was Nineveh. Genesis chapter 10, verse 11, etc. It derived its name apparently from Ashur, the son of Shem. Genesis chapter 10, verse 22, who in later times was worshipped by the Assyrians as their chief god. Later on, Smith also said, Scripture informs us that Assyria was peopled from Babylon. Genesis chapter 10, verse 11. And both classical tradition and the monuments of the country agree in this representation. Easton said that Assyria was the, quote, name derived from the city Ashur on the Tigris. The original capital of the country was originally a colony from Babylonia, and was ruled by viceroys from that kingdom. So, it seems that Assyrian and Babylonian history are somewhat interconnected. The question remains, did Ashur build Nineveh and the other two cities in Assyria, or did Nimrod, the ruler of Babel, build three cities within what became Assyria? The only clue I found in the Bible, actually, I stumbled upon it in a sermon I heard, so technically I didn't find it, is in Micah chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. And this man shall be our peace, when the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces. Then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. And he shall deliver us from the Assyrian, when he cometh into our land, and when he treadeth within our border. These verses seem to be referring to the second coming of the Messiah, when he will rule the world from Jerusalem in his millennial reign, before the time of judgment. Notice that there seems to be repetition in these two verses. I believe these verses are part of a poem. The prophets used poetry in their prophecies sometimes, which is why these two verses are repetitive. Notice where it says, quote, the Assyrian shall come into our land, and where it says, quote, when he shall tread in our palaces. These two sections seem to be poetically repetitive, probably containing synonyms. If those two sections of verse 5 are repetitive, then it's probably also repetitive where it says, quote, they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and where it says, quote, the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. This would mean that Micah recognized Nimrod as being connected to Assyria, not that he was including Babylon, though Babel does have connections to Nimrod in his prophecy. Though I personally thought it was more likely that Ashur founded Nineveh, Micah seems to disagree. It seems like the ASV correctly translated Genesis chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. It's interesting. It seems like all of the sons of Mizraim have names in the plural. Notice that they all end with an I and an M. Like I said earlier, this makes me think that it's referring to groups of people, not individuals, though they were probably begun by people with corresponding singular names. Who the Philistines were seems to be somewhat of a mystery, and I'm not sure that the explanations I've heard and read are good enough, because they don't seem to address some loose ends. Sometime in the future I may publish an article on my website to try to explain who they were and where they came from. Continuing on in verse 15 it says, and Canaan begat Sidon his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Archite, and the Sinite, and the Arvadite, and the Zemarite, and the Hamathite, and afterward were the families of the Canaanite spread abroad. And the border of the Canaanite was from Sidon, as thou goest toward Gerar, unto Gaza, as thou goest toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim, unto Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, after their families, after their tongues, in their lands, in their nations. All the children of Canaan lived in the land of Canaan. Smith says that Zidon, called here Sidon, was still a city in his time, though called Seda. Easton said this of Jebus, trodden hard, or fastness, or the waterless hill, the name of the Canaanitish city which stood on Mount Zion. Joshua chapter 15 verse 8, chapter 18 verse 16, and verse 28. Verse 19 seems hard to understand to me, but basically the border of Canaan was as far north as Sidon, which was by the sea, as far south as around Gaza by the sea, and as far east from the coast as around Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Lasha, which seems to have been close to Zoar according to the information in Genesis chapter 14, verses 1 through 3. If you look for Sidon, Gaza, and Zoar on a map of Canaan or ancient Israel, this should give you a good picture of Canaan's border according to Genesis chapter 10. In general, Ham's children spread out towards the south. Aside from my videos being on my YouTube channel, the videos from this Bible study series can also be found in an organized and easy to navigate way on my website. The first 10 videos in this series are now available for download at the Danaglas store. More information can be found at www.danaglas.com/store.